The rain had not stopped for 3 days over Varn's Landing, and the mud in the streets had turned the color of old rust. Traders pulled their carts under tin roofs, and the insectoid Trevik clicked their mandibles in annoyance every time a cart wheel got stuck. It was on this wet, gray morning that a stranger walked into the small land office at the edge of town, water dripping from his coat, carrying nothing but a single metal case and a rolled-up map. The clerk behind the counter, a Koru named Sela Nim, looked up with tired eyes. She had seen many strangers come through Varn's Landing, mostly prospectors looking for cheap or rights or desperate settlers looking for any patch of dirt to call home. But something about this one was different. He was human, and humans were rare this far out on the frontier. Most of them stayed close to the core worlds, where life was easier and safer. "Can I help you?" Sela asked, setting down her stamp. "I want to buy land," the man said. His voice was calm, almost bored, like he was asking for a cup of water. "Something cheap. I don't need much." Sela almost laughed. Cheap land was not hard to find in Varn's Landing. In fact, there was only one parcel left that nobody wanted, and it had been sitting untouched in the records for over 40 years. She pulled out an old data slate and turned it toward him, showing a faded map with a large green shape marked in warning red at its edges. "There's one plot left," she said carefully. "It's practically free. But I have to warn you, mister." "What did you say your name was?" "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Ross." "Mr. Ross," Sela continued, "that plot sits right against the hollow expanse. You know what that is?" Daniel shook his head slowly, studying the map. Sela took a breath, the way people do when they are about to repeat a story they have told 100 times before. She explained that the hollow expanse was not just a forest. It was thousands of square kilometers of thick, ancient trees that no scanner could properly map, no drone could properly cross, and no settler had ever lived inside for more than a few nights without vanishing or running back to town half out of their mind with fear. She told him about the deep growls that shook the ground at night, about livestock that disappeared without a trace, about lights that moved between the trunks like eyes watching from the dark. "The old-timers call it the old growl," she said. "Something big lives in there. Something that doesn't like visitors." Daniel listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, he simply nodded and asked, "How much for the plot?" Sela blinked. "Did you hear what I just said?" "I heard you," Daniel replied. "How much?" She named a number so small it was almost insulting, mostly because the colony government just wanted someone, anyone, to take responsibility for the land so they could stop paying for its upkeep on paper. Daniel reached into his coat, pulled out a thin credit chip, and placed it on the counter without hesitation. Word moved fast in a small town. By the time Daniel had signed the last form and stepped back out into the rain, half of Varn's Landing already knew that a human had bought the forest plot. Some laughed. Some shook their heads in pity. A grizzled Trevik trader named Kor Vass, sitting outside the general store with a mug of fermented root drink, watched the human walk past with his metal case and rolled-up map, heading straight toward the dark green line of trees on the horizon. "He won't last a week," Kor muttered to no one in particular. But Daniel wasn't thinking about lasting. He had spent the last 10 years of his life working construction crews on hostile mining worlds, fixing life support systems in places far more dangerous than any forest. He had seen colonies collapse from panic more often than from actual monsters. Fear, he had learned, was usually louder than the real danger it pointed to. He walked for almost 2 hours before he reached the treeline. The trees here were massive, their bark a strange bluish-gray, their leaves so thick that almost no daylight reached the ground beneath them. Even from a distance, he could feel a strange hum in the air, like the whole forest was breathing slowly, patiently. Somewhere far off, a low sound rolled through the ground, deep and heavy, like something enormous shifting its weight. Daniel stopped at the edge, set down his case, and looked into the darkness between the trunks for a long moment. He didn't feel fear, exactly. He felt curiosity, and beneath that, a quiet kind of determination he hadn't felt in years. "All right," he said softly, to no one but the trees. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." Behind him, back in Varn's Landing, the rain finally began to ease, and the townsfolk who had gathered at their windows to watch the strange human walk toward his doom slowly returned to their business, certain they had just seen the last of him. They had no idea how wrong they were. Night fell fast under the canopy of the hollow expanse, faster than Daniel had expected. One moment the sky above the treetops was a dull orange, and the next, the forest floor was swallowed in near-total darkness, broken only by faint threads of blue light glowing from patches of moss on the tree trunks. Daniel sat inside his half-built shelter, a simple frame of salvaged metal plating he had hauled from an old wrecked freighter he'd bought for scrap price, and listened. The sound started slowly. First came the wind moving through the high branches, a soft whistling sound that was almost peaceful. Then came something else, low and deep, a groan that seemed to come from the ground itself rather than from any single direction. Daniel felt it more than heard it, a vibration that traveled up through his boots and into his chest. He sat very still, waiting, his hand resting on the small tool kit beside him rather than any weapon. He had brought no gun. He had considered it, back in Varn's Landing, but decided against it. Guns made people careless, made them think a fight was always the answer. Instead, he had brought sensors, a dozen small motion detectors he had built himself from spare parts, and a portable data recorder to log every sound the forest made through the night. The first detector went off around midnight, its little light blinking red. Something large had moved past, maybe 30 meters from his shelter. Daniel didn't move to look. He simply noted the time and the direction on his slate. A few minutes later, a second detector triggered, then a third, forming a rough line that suggested whatever it was had simply walked past his camp and kept going, uninterested. By the third night, Daniel had a working theory. The great growls that shook the ground were not hunting calls. They were spaced too evenly, too rhythmically, more like something calling out to mark its territory than something searching for prey. He began to suspect the forest's most feared sound belonged not to a monster stalking for blood, but to something large and mostly indifferent to him, so long as he didn't get too close to wherever it considered home. During the days, Daniel worked. He reinforced his shelter, dug a small trench for drainage, and began mapping the immediate area around his camp using an old surveying tool he had repaired himself. He noted the strange blue moss that seemed to glow brighter when he came near it, and the way certain trees pulsed faintly with warmth, as if the whole forest sat above some vast underground heat source. He remembered, vaguely, mentions of geothermal activity in the old colony surveys Sella had shown him. Perhaps that explained the tremors, the warmth, even the strange lights people mistook for glowing eyes in the dark. On the fifth night, something finally came close. Daniel woke to a sound unlike anything he had recorded before, a deep, rolling roar that seemed to come from just beyond the tree line near his shelter. His sensors lit up all at once. He sat up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movement, and peered out through a gap in the metal plating. Two enormous eyes reflected the faint blue moss light back at him, set into a head the size of a small vehicle. The creature's body was mostly hidden in shadow, but Daniel could make out thick, plated skin and long limbs built for pushing through dense brush rather than for chasing prey. It stood there for a long moment, simply watching him, its breath visible in the cool night air. Daniel's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay still and quiet. He remembered something an old engineer had told him years ago. On a mining world crawling with far more aggressive creatures, predators chase what runs, and they test what stays still. He held his ground, made no sudden movement, and slowly, deliberately, lowered his gaze rather than staring directly into the creature's eyes. After what felt like an hour but was likely only a minute, the great beast let out one more low, rumbling call, turned, and melted back into the darkness of the trees as silently as it had appeared. Daniel didn't sleep again that night, but not because he was afraid. He sat awake going over what he had just seen, adding new notes to his slate, sketching rough details of the creature's size and shape. It had not attacked. It had not even seemed particularly hostile, only curious and cautious, much like he was. By morning, word had somehow already reached Varn's Landing. Carried by a scout drone Sella had quietly sent to check on the mad human's camp from a safe distance. The drone's footage showed Daniel's shelter still standing, smoke rising gently from a small cooking fire, and the man himself sitting outside, calmly writing in a notebook as if he had spent the night in a quiet countryside cabin rather than at the edge of a forest everyone believed to be cursed. In the town square, disbelief slowly turned into whispered curiosity. The human was still alive. not only alive, but seemingly unharmed. And worse, or perhaps better, he did not seem afraid at all. 3 weeks into his new life at the edge of the hollow expanse, Daniel had begun to notice a pattern he could not explain with instruments alone. Small piles of stones appeared near his camp overnight, stacked in neat little towers that had definitely not been there before. At first, he assumed it was some kind of natural process, maybe loose rocks shifting during the ground tremors. But the stacks were too precise, too deliberate, to be an accident of nature. One morning, he found a stack of stones arranged in a rough circle around a single fallen fruit, one he did not recognize, purple-skinned and heavy, placed carefully in the center like an offering. Daniel stared at it for a long time before picking it up. It smelled sweet, almost like fermented berries, and felt slightly warm to the touch, as if it had recently come from somewhere close to the forest's underground heat. He did not eat it. Instead, he set it on a flat stone near his shelter and, on instinct, left a small metal tool beside it in return, an old wrench he no longer needed. The next morning, both were gone, and in their place sat a small woven basket made of thin, silver-colored reeds. It took another 2 weeks of this quiet exchange before Daniel finally saw them. He was out mapping a shallow ravine when he noticed movement at the edge of his vision, quick and low to the ground. He turned slowly, remembering the lesson the great beast had taught him weeks earlier about staying calm, and saw a small figure crouched behind a moss-covered root. It was humanoid in shape but smaller than a human child, with pale silver skin that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim forest light, and large, round eyes the color of polished metal. The figure froze the moment it realized it had been seen. Daniel froze too, careful not to make any sudden movement. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the only sound between them the faint hum of the forest itself. "Hello," Daniel said softly, keeping his voice low and even. "I'm not going to hurt you." The small figure tilted its head, studying him with an expression that seemed more curious than afraid. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it slipped back into the undergrowth and was gone. Over the following days, Daniel began leaving small gifts near the stone circle each morning, simple tools, bits of fabric, anything useful he could spare. Slowly, cautiously, the exchanges grew more frequent, and one evening, as the sun began to set behind the canopy, 3 of the small silver-eyed beings finally approached his camp together, staying just at the edge of the firelight. They called themselves the Ethrell, though it took many patient days of gestures, drawings in the dirt, and simple words before Daniel understood even that much. They had lived in the hollow expanse for longer than any records in Varn's Landing could account for, hidden deep within the forest, avoiding the outside colonists who they believed only ever came to take, never to understand. Through careful conversation, helped along by a translation device Daniel had modified from old freighter parts, he began to learn the truth behind the legends that had frightened generations of settlers. The great beast that roared in the night was called, in the Ethrell's own language, something that translated roughly to Old Warden, an enormous creature that patrolled the forest not to hunt travelers, but to protect the delicate balance of plants and smaller creatures living beneath the canopy. It attacked only those who threatened that balance, cutting down ancient trees or poisoning the underground water with mining waste, as some early prospectors had once tried to do. The vanished settlers, the ones whose disappearances had built the forest's terrifying reputation, had mostly not been eaten or killed at all. Some had simply gotten lost in the confusing, ever-shifting terrain and wandered until they found their own way out, shaken but alive. Others, the ones who came with weapons and bad intentions, had been quietly, firmly turned back by the Ethrell themselves, frightened into leaving and never returning, their stories growing wilder with each retelling back in town. Daniel sat with this information for a long while, turning it over in his mind. The forest was not cursed. It was misunderstood, protected by a species most colonists didn't even know existed, guarded by creatures that reacted to threats rather than searching for victims. "You could have just talked to them," Daniel said one evening, more to himself than to the Ethrell elder sitting across the fire from him. The elder, whose name translated closest to something like Quiet Root, simply shook her small head. "Talk," she said slowly, still learning his language, never worked before. "You did not run. You did not fight. You watched. You waited." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding. In a forest full of misunderstandings built on fear, he had simply chosen patience instead, and it had opened a door that fear alone had kept locked for generations. Back in Varn's Landing, rumors continued to grow. The human had not just survived a month in the hollow expanse. According to the last scout drone footage, he now had visitors, small silver figures seen briefly at the edge of his camp before vanishing back into the trees. Corvass had never liked wasting time, and he considered this trip into the hollow expanse to be exactly that. The old Trevik trader had spent 30 years in Varn's Landing, buying and selling everything from scrap metal to medicine, and in all that time, he had never once believed the wild stories about the forest. Monsters that ate travelers whole, lights that stole men's minds. None of it matched anything he had ever seen with his own eyes. What he did believe, however, was that a human living quietly at the forest's edge for 2 months straight, apparently unharmed and now supposedly trading with some unknown native species, was either the biggest liar on the planet or something worth seeing for himself. He gathered 3 others willing to make the trip, mostly out of curiosity rather than courage. A young Koru engineer eager to see any new technology the human might have built, an older trader hoping to scout potential business, and a nervous scout who mostly came along because Kor had insisted. They set out early, following the same muddy road Daniel had walked months before, and reached the tree line by midday. The forest looked exactly as unsettling as its reputation suggested, thick and dark, humming faintly with unseen life. But there, just past the first line of trees, stood a proper structure now, no longer just a makeshift shelter but a small, sturdy homestead built from salvaged metal and forest wood, with neat rows of strange plants growing beside it, and a stone circle at its center that none of them recognized. Daniel stepped out to greet them before they had even finished approaching, looking calm and healthy, his beard longer than it had been, his clothes patched but clean. "Didn't expect visitors," he said simply. Kor crossed his arms, studying the human closely. "We came to see if the stories were true." Before Daniel could answer, the ground shuddered beneath their feet, hard enough to make the nervous scout stumble. Daniel's expression shifted instantly from calm to alert. He turned toward the tree line, listening carefully to something the others couldn't yet hear. "That's not the old warden," he muttered, almost to himself. "That's something else." Within moments, the reason became clear. A swarm of creatures burst up from beneath the forest floor near the edge of Daniel's homestead. Dozens of them, low and fast, with hard shells and sharp digging claws clearly built for burrowing rather than fighting in the open. Daniel had seen similar creatures before during his mapping expeditions, usually deep underground, never this close to the surface. "They're being pushed up," Daniel said quickly, already moving toward a small control panel he had built into the side of his shelter. "The ground's heating faster than usual. Has to be a shift in the vents below." Kor had no idea what he was talking about, but he understood a threat when he saw one. The swarm was moving fast, spreading out across the clearing, and the panicked scout had already backed himself against the homestead wall, clearly unsure whether to run or fight. "Stay together," Daniel shouted, working quickly at his panel. "Don't scatter. They go after anything alone." The young Koru engineer, to his credit, moved to help Daniel rather than freeze, quickly understanding the basic wiring Daniel pointed out. Together, they redirected a set of underground vent lines Daniel had mapped weeks earlier while studying the forest's geothermal activity, forcing a surge of heat through the tunnels the creatures had just climbed out of. The effect was immediate. The swarm, sensitive to sudden heat shifts underground, began retreating back into the tunnels in a chaotic rush, no longer interested in the group of frightened visitors above. Within minutes, the clearing was quiet again. The danger passed as quickly as it had arrived. Kor stood in stunned silence, staring at the empty clearing, then at Daniel, who was already checking the panel readings as if nothing unusual had happened at all. "You knew that was coming," Kor said slowly. "I knew the vents had been unstable the last few days," Daniel replied. "Didn't know it'd bring the diggers up so soon. Should have built a better warning system." The old trader let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "Should have. Listen to yourself. You just saved 4 lives with wires and dirt, and you're worried about a warning system." For the first time since they'd arrived, Kor looked at Daniel not with suspicion, but with something closer to respect. He glanced around the small, well-organized homestead. At the neat vent markers Daniel had clearly placed with real understanding of the ground beneath them. At the quiet, careful order of a place everyone back in town still believed to be cursed ground. Colonies spent decades avoiding this forest, Core said quietly. You've spent 2 months learning to live with it. Daniel shrugged, wiping dirt from his hands. Wasn't trying to prove anything. Just needed somewhere to live. But as the group made their way back toward Varn's Landing that evening, shaken but unharmed, Core couldn't stop thinking about what he'd just witnessed. The forest wasn't the monster everyone believed it to be. It was simply misunderstood, dangerous only to those who refused to understand it. And one quiet human, with nothing but patience and a few salvage tools, had learned to work with it rapidly. By the time they reached town, the story of the digger swarm and the humans' quick thinking had already begun to spread, growing a little more impressive with each retelling, just as the old, fearful stories once had. The meeting hall in Varn's Landing had not been this full in years. Word of Core Vass's trip into the hollow expanse had spread through every street and shop in town, and now, barely a week later, half the colony had crowded inside to hear the trader tell his story in person. Nim stood near the front, arms crossed, listening carefully as Core described the digger swarm, the quick thinking with the vent lines, and the strange, quiet homestead the human had built at the forest's edge. He didn't fight it, Core said, his voice carrying across the crowded hall. He understood it. There's a difference. Murmurs spread through the room. For generations, the hollow expanse had been treated as something to avoid entirely, a dead zone on every colony map, useful for nothing but scaring children into staying close to town after dark. Now, one human had spent barely 2 months there and already understood more about the forest's dangers and its patterns than the colony had learned in decades of careful distance. Sella raised a hand, waiting for the room to quiet before speaking. The real question, she said, isn't whether Daniel Ross can survive in there. He's clearly proven that already. The question is whether the rest of us can learn anything useful from what he's found. It was a fair question, and one that led, over the following weeks, to a small but steady stream of visitors making their way to Daniel's homestead. Some came out of simple curiosity. Others, more practically minded, came hoping to learn about the forest's resources, the strange glowing moss that seemed to have medicinal properties, the geothermal vents that could potentially power a much larger settlement than Varn's Landing currently supported. Daniel welcomed them all cautiously, always mindful of the fragile trust he had built with the Ethrell. He made it clear, firmly but politely, that any dealings with the forest had to respect the balance the Ethrell had protected for generations. No mining without permission. No cutting the ancient trees. No disturbing the underground water sources the old warden and countless smaller creatures depended on. To his surprise, most colonists agreed readily enough. After decades of fear, the idea of finally understanding the forest, rather than simply avoiding it, was worth a few restrictions. Quiet Root, the Ethrell elder, watched these developments with careful, patient eyes. She had lived long enough to remember the early days of the colony, when careless prospectors had first stumbled into the forest and left destruction behind them, poisoning a stretch of underground water that had taken years for the forest to heal. Trusting outsiders again had not come easily, and it certainly had not come because of any of Daniel's words alone. "You did not promise us safety," she said to him one evening, as a small group of colonists set up a modest trading post near the tree line under Daniel's careful guidance. "You showed us patience instead. That is worth more." Daniel, never entirely comfortable with praise, simply nodded and returned to work, helping the colonists properly mark safe pathways through the forest's outer edge, pathways the Ethrell themselves had quietly approved. Within 2 months, the transformation was clear for anyone in Varn's Landing to see. A narrow but steady trade path now wound through the forest's edge, marked with simple stone markers the Ethrell had helped design, leading to a small but growing settlement no longer huddled fearfully at the tree line, but built confidently just inside it. Daniel's original homestead had grown into a proper way station, complete with a small trading post, a modest clinic using medicine derived from the glowing moss, and even the beginnings of a school where young Ethrell and colonist children occasionally sat together, curious about each other in a way their parents had never been given the chance to be. Selanim, once the nervous clerk who had tried to talk Daniel out of buying the land in the first place, now proudly told visitors that the hollow expanse settlement had brought more new trade and interest to Varn's Landing than anything in the colony's recent history. Not everyone welcomed this change, however. Word of the growing peace between the colony and the forest had reached further than Varn's Landing, all the way to a mining corporation called Deepcore Extraction, a company that had built much of its business around selling expensive protective gear and hazard insurance to colonists too afraid of the hollow expanse to venture near it themselves. A peaceful, thriving settlement at the forest's edge, one that no longer needed their overpriced equipment or fear-driven contracts, was very bad for their business. Daniel didn't know it yet, standing at the edge of his growing way station one quiet evening, watching Ethrell children laugh alongside young colonists near the trading post. But the peace he had so carefully built was about to be tested by something far more dangerous than any creature the forest had ever produced. The message arrived at Varn's Landing on a bright, clear morning, carried by a sleek corporate courier ship that most of the townsfolk had never seen the likes of before. Deepcore Extraction, a mining company with contracts spread across a dozen frontier worlds, announced they were sending a representative to assess new opportunities near the hollow expanse. Selenim read the message twice before showing it to Daniel, a knot of unease forming in her stomach that she couldn't quite explain. The representative, a smooth-talking Koru named Devrick Halloway, arrived 3 days later with an entourage of assistants and a stack of official-looking documents. He wasted no time visiting the growing settlement at the forest's edge, praising the trade path and the way station with polite, practiced enthusiasm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Impressive work," Devrick said, walking through the small trading post with Daniel and Sella close behind. "Truly. But I have to wonder, has anyone properly surveyed the mineral potential beneath all this? The geothermal activity alone suggests significant untapped resources." Daniel's expression remained calm, though his tone grew firmer. "The forest isn't for mining. That was made clear to every settler here from the start." Devrick smiled thinly. Of course. I'm simply here to observe, for now." But within days, quiet rumors began spreading through Varn's Landing, rumors that didn't match anything Daniel or the Ethrell had actually done. Whispers claimed Daniel was secretly hoarding valuable resources from the forest for himself, that the Ethrell were being manipulated into giving away their territory for nothing in return, that the entire peaceful arrangement was nothing more than a clever trick to keep the real riches of the hollow expanse hidden from the rest of the colony. Daniel first heard the rumors from Corvass, who arrived at the homestead looking more troubled than Daniel had ever seen him. "People are starting to believe it," Cor said grimly. "Not everyone, but enough. Devrick's been buying drinks and telling stories at the tavern every night this week." Daniel felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not fear exactly, but something close to it, the same feeling he imagined the Ethrell must have felt every time outsiders had broken their trust in the past. He couldn't let this unravel everything they had built. That night, Daniel sat with Quiet Root beside the small fire near his homestead, explaining what he'd learned. The Ethrell elder listened in silence, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "They wish to take what Patience built," she said finally, "using fear, the way it was always used against us before." Daniel nodded slowly. "We need proof. Something that shows the truth clearly enough that rumors can't compete with it." Working through the night, Daniel pulled together records from his sensor network, the same simple motion detectors and data logs he had used since his very first nights in the forest. Combined with careful documentation the Ethrell provided about every exchange, every trade, every resource shared since the settlement began, the evidence painted a clear and honest picture, one very different from Devrick's whispered rumors. The following week, Daniel called for an open meeting at Varn's Landing, inviting the entire town, including Devrick Halloway himself. Selenim, now firmly on Daniel's side after months of watching the settlement grow, helped organize the gathering in the same crowded hall where Kor had once told his story of the digger swarm. Daniel stood before the crowd, laying out the evidence plainly and without exaggeration. He showed the trade logs, transparent records of every tool, every resource, every agreement made between the colonists and the Ethrell since the very beginning. He showed messages, quietly gathered by Core and a few trusted traders, revealing Deverick's private conversations pushing colonists toward supporting a full mining survey. Conversations that made his company's true intentions clear. Deverick, cornered by the mounting evidence and the increasingly unfriendly murmurs of the crowd, tried weakly to argue that deep core extraction only wanted to help the colony grow. But the room had already turned against him, the careful lies unraveling in the face of simple, honest proof. "You tried to use fear to take something patience built," Sella said firmly, echoing the words Quiet Root had spoken days earlier. "That won't work here anymore." Within days, Deverick and his entourage quietly left Varn's Landing, their courier ship departing without the mining contracts they had hoped to secure. The Colony Council, shaken by how close they had come to losing everything Daniel and the Ethrell had built together, moved quickly to formally protect the hollow expanse, declaring it shared territory between the colony and the Ethrell, safe from future corporate interference. Months later, standing once again at the edge of his original homestead, now surrounded by a thriving settlement of mixed traders, growing gardens, and children of different species playing together near the trading post, Daniel watched the soft blue glow of moss light flicker between the trees as evening settled over the forest. The hollow expanse was no longer a place of fear. It had simply needed someone willing to understand it, rather than run from it. And in the quiet peace of that understanding, an entire colony had learned something it would carry forward for generations to come.